There's a particular quality to summer in eastern Kentucky that defenses slowly wear down. A thick, humid weight that settles into the hollows and refuses to leave. In the summer of 1987, that heaviness seemed especially pronounced in the small town of Harlan County, where the Green Mountains pressed close against modest homes and the remnants of coal mining heritage stood like silent sentinels over communities that had seen better days. Harlan was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where 3 generations might live within a stone's throw of each other, where the church bells on Sunday morning could be heard from one end of town to the other. It was a place built on hard work and harder lives where men descended into the earth for their livelihoods, and families held tight to each other because that's all they had. The mountains that surrounded them were beautiful and brutal in equal measure, offering shelter and isolation, protection and imprisonment. That July, the kudzu vines were climbing telephone poles with aggressive determination. Cicadas sang their electric songs in the twilight hours, and the air smelled of cut grass, diesel fuel from passing coal trucks, and the persistent earthy scent of the surrounding forest. Children still played outside until the streetlights came on. Doors were left unlocked. The evening news was something that happened to other people in other places. 16-year-old Angela Salmons embodied everything hopeful about small-town summer. She had honey blonde hair that caught the sunlight, a laugh that her mother Patricia would later describe as like wind chimes, and dreams that stretched far beyond the mountain ridges. Angela was set to start her junior year at Harlan County High School that fall. She wanted to study veterinary medicine, had a collection of stray cats she'd rescued over the years, and volunteered at the county animal shelter every Saturday morning without fail. Her father, Robert Salmons, worked at the remaining operational mine just outside town, third shift, which meant he slept during the day while the house bustled around him. Her younger brother, Michael, was 13 that summer, all gangly limbs and adolescent awkwardness, perpetually annoyed by his sister but fiercely protective when anyone else dared criticize her. Patricia worked at the Piggly Wiggly on Main Street, the social hub where gossip and groceries were exchanged in equal measure. The Salmons family lived in a white clapboard house on Maple Street, distinguished by Patricia's meticulously maintained flower garden. Roses, black-eyed Susans, and her prized hydrangeas that bloomed in impossible shades of blue. Angela had her own small garden plot where she grew herbs she'd read could help sick animals. Lavender for calming, chamomile for digestion. A teenage girl's earnest attempt to heal the world, one stray cat at a time. July 18, 1987 dawned hot and hazy, the kind of morning where the humidity was visible, hanging in the air like a veil. Patricia would remember years later that she'd made Angela's favorite breakfast that morning. French toast with powdered sugar and strawberries from their neighbor's patch. She'd remember that Angela had been humming while she ate, some song from the radio. She'd remember that her daughter had kissed her cheek before leaving, something teenagers don't always remember to do, and said, "Love you, Mama." Angela was meeting her best friend Casey Mitchell at the public pool that afternoon. It was a Saturday tradition for them that summer, spreading out towels on the hot concrete, smelling of coconut sunscreen, talking about boys and college and all the future years that stretched before them like an endless highway. But first, Angela was going to walk the trail behind the high school, the one that wound up through the woods to a clearing where she sometimes brought injured birds to release them back into the wild. She left the house at 10:47 a.m. Patricia knew the exact time because she'd checked the kitchen clock thinking Angela was running late to meet Casey. She was wearing denim shorts, a yellow tank top, and her worn Converse sneakers, the ones with doodles all over them that she'd drawn during study hall. She carried a small backpack with a towel, her Walkman, a cassette of Whitney Houston's latest album, and a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. The last person to see Angela Salmons alive, or at least the last person who would admit to it, was old Mr. Henderson, who lived at the end of Maple Street where the pavement gave way to the dirt trail. He was watering his tomato plants when Angela passed. She'd waved to him, called out, "Morning, Mr. Henderson," in that bright, unhesitating way young people greet the world. He'd waved back, watched her disappear into the tree line, her blonde hair swinging. By 1:30 p.m., when Angela hadn't shown up at the pool, Casey called the Salmons house. By 3 p.m., Patricia was calling Angela's other friends. By 5 p.m., Robert was awake early from his sleep, standing in the kitchen still in his undershirt while Patricia's hands shook as she dialed the police. By the time the sun set that evening, casting long shadows through those dense Kentucky woods, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood orange, Angela Salmons had been missing for nearly 7 hours. And in a town where everyone knew everyone, where nothing bad was supposed to happen, where the mountains were supposed to keep the world's evil at bay, something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The woods that had witnessed whatever happened remained silent, patient, keeping their secrets close. But woods remember. Even when people forget, when cases go cold, when decades pass and the world moves on, woods remember. And 38 years later, those woods would finally speak. The incident, when the music stopped Saturday evening in Harlan County, typically meant families gathering for dinner. The smell of fried chicken and biscuits drifting from open windows, children catching fireflies in mason jars as darkness fell. But on July 18, 1987, normal had already shattered. At 5:23 p.m., Patricia Salmons made the phone call that would change everything. Her voice, according to the dispatcher who took the call, was controlled but taut. The voice of a mother fighting panic, trying to believe there was still a reasonable explanation. "My daughter was supposed to meet her friend at noon," Patricia said. "She left the house this morning. She never came home." Deputy Marshal Crawford was the first to respond. A 32-year-old officer who'd grown up in Harlan, Crawford knew the Salmons family. Knew everyone in town, really. He arrived at the house at 5:41 p.m., his patrol car parking in front of those blue hydrangeas, and Patricia met him at the door before he could knock. Her face, he would later testify, showed the particular terror that only a parent of a missing child knows, hope and horror wrestling behind her eyes. Robert stood in the living room, his coal-stained work boots still by the door, turning Angela's house key over and over in his hands. She'd left it on the hook by the door. She hadn't planned to be gone long. Deputy Crawford took down the details methodically. Angela Marie Salmons, 16 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, approximately 118 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing denim shorts, yellow tank top, white Converse sneakers with drawings on them, carrying a blue backpack with a peace sign button on it. Last seen at approximately 10:47 a.m. heading toward the trail system behind Harlan County High School. She was going to walk to the clearing, Patricia explained, her hands gripping a dish towel she didn't remember picking up. She does that sometimes. Takes the trail up through the woods. It comes out near the pool. But she never made it to the pool. Casey waited for 2 hours. Casey Mitchell had come to the house by then, her own mother driving her over. The 17-year-old girl sat on the Salmons' floral couch crying quietly, feeling the terrible guilt of the unharmed survivor. She was supposed to be there at noon, Casey kept saying. We had plans. Angela's never late, never. By 6:15 p.m., more officers had arrived. Sheriff Tom Grayson, a barrel-chested man of 56 who'd been in law enforcement since before most of his deputies were born, stood in the Salmons' kitchen coordinating the initial response. The first rule in a missing persons case, especially involving a minor: time is everything. Every hour that passes decreases the probability of a safe recovery. Everyone knew this, though no one said it aloud. "We need to search that trail," Grayson said. "Get as many people as we can. We've got maybe 2 hours of good daylight left." Word spread through Harlan the way urgent news always does in small towns. Phone trees activating, neighbors telling neighbors, the network of interconnection mobilizing. By 7 p.m., more than 40 people had gathered at the trailhead behind the high school. Volunteers ranging from teenagers to elderly men who could barely walk but refused to stay home. They carried flashlights, called Angela's name into the darkening woods, searched the trail that she'd walked 100 times before. The trail itself was well worn but not maintained. A 3-mile loop that climbed up through dense hardwood forest, crossed a small creek, opened into a clearing about 1.5 miles in, then looped back down. Local kids had used it for years. Couples walked it. Hunters knew every inch. It should have been safe. It had always been safe. Michael, Angela's 13-year-old brother, walked the trail 3 times that night with different search groups, his voice growing hoarse from calling his sister's name. Each time he passed their house, visible from certain points on the trail's upper section, he could see his mother standing in the yard, silhouetted against the porch light, waiting. At 9:34 p.m., a volunteer named James Rutherford found the first piece of evidence. About 2 miles up the trail, 20 feet off the main path in a thicket of mountain laurel, he discovered Angela's backpack. The blue one with the peace sign button. It was lying partially concealed beneath leaves and brush as though it had been thrown or placed there deliberately. The discovery brought every searcher running. Sheriff Grayson carefully pulled on gloves and examined the backpack where it lay. The contents were still inside: the towel, the Walkman with the headphones tangled, the Whitney Houston cassette, the peanut butter sandwich still wrapped. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, but the backpack being off the trail, hidden, meant something had happened. Something that made Angela drop or lose her belongings. Something that meant this was no longer just a missing teenager who'd lost track of time. "Everybody back to the trail," Grayson called out. "This is a crime scene now. Nobody touches anything else." A crime scene. The words hung in the humid night air. In the distance, a mother stood in her yard, waiting for news. And in the woods, the search had transformed from hopeful to desperate. They searched through the night. More volunteers arrived. By midnight, over 100 people combed those woods. The Harlan Fire Department brought industrial lights. The Kentucky State Police sent additional officers and a search dog, a German shepherd named Ranger, who picked up Angela's scent from clothing provided by her mother but lost it near where the backpack had been found, circling in confusion as if the trail simply ended. How does a scent trail end? That was the question no one wanted to answer. It ends when someone gets into a vehicle, or into water, or the thought no one voiced, when someone stops moving. Patricia Sammons didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table while her sister Barbara made pot after pot of coffee that no one drank. Robert walked the trail again and again, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness, calling his daughter's name until his voice broke. Michael sat on the front porch steps, refusing to go inside, watching the woods that had swallowed his sister. Sunday dawned gray and threatening rain. The search expanded. The state police brought in additional resources, more dogs, an ATV unit to search farther terrain, a helicopter that flew grid patterns over the dense canopy. News crews arrived from Lexington and Louisville, their satellite vans parking on Main Street, reporters doing stand-ups in front of the high school. A Harlan County teenager vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine walk to meet a friend. The Piggly Wiggly became command central. Patricia's manager cleared the break room and it filled with maps, volunteers signing up for search shifts, donated food for searchers. The community mobilized with the fierce loyalty small towns are capable of, everyone knowing this could have been their daughter, their sister, their friend. Detectives interviewed everyone Angela had known. Friends described her as responsible, kind, not the type to run away or do something reckless. Teachers called her a model student. The volunteer coordinator at the animal shelter said she'd been there just the day before, bottle-feeding 3 newborn kittens. A teenage girl deeply embedded in her community, planning for her future with no reason to disappear. Casey Mitchell described their plans in detail. "We were going to lay out at the pool, then maybe go to the movies that night. There was a showing of Dirty Dancing we wanted to see. She was so excited about it. We'd been planning it all week. Angela wouldn't just not show up. Something happened to her. Something bad." Theories began to circulate. Had a stranger been passing through? Harlan County was relatively isolated, but the main highway connected to Interstate 75 eventually. Truckers, drifters, anyone could have been in the area. Had it been someone local? The thought was almost too terrible to consider, but it whispered through town anyway. Someone we know. Someone we trust. The trail was processed as a crime scene. Investigators found footprints near where the backpack had been discovered. Several sets, though the dry summer ground made clear impressions difficult. They found what appeared to be drag marks leading away from the trail, heading deeper into the forest, but they disappeared in rocky terrain after about 30 yards. They found a broken branch at shoulder height, as if someone had pushed through the underbrush in a hurry. But they didn't find Angela. By Sunday evening, 48 hours missing, the temperature of the search had changed. The frantic hope of the first night had cooled into something grimmer. Volunteers still searched, but now they looked for a body. No one said it, but everyone thought it. A teenage girl doesn't vanish completely without help. Either someone took her away or someone left her where she couldn't be found. Patricia Salmons appeared on the evening news, standing in front of her home, Robert beside her with his arm around her shoulders. "Please," Patricia said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "If you have my daughter, please let her come home. If you know anything, please call. We just want Angela back. We just want our baby back." The phone number for tips appeared on screen. The hotline, set up by the state police, began ringing immediately. Most calls were well-meaning but useless. Someone had seen a girl matching Angela's description at a truck stop 40 miles away. It wasn't her. Someone else had heard screaming in the woods weeks ago, unverified. A psychic called to say she saw water and darkness, unhelpful. But investigators followed every lead, hoping that somewhere in the noise was the signal that would bring Angela home. A week passed. The search continued but scaled back. Professionals now, cadaver dogs, systematic grid searches of the surrounding forest. The community held a vigil at the high school football field. 500 people came holding candles, singing hymns, praying for a miracle. Angela's best friends stood in a group, holding each other, sobbing. Her teachers attended. The entire football team came. In a town of 3,000 people, it seemed everyone was there. The summer wore on. The investigation continued. Detectives interviewed over 300 people. They polygraphed several individuals, cleared them all. They investigated anyone with a criminal record within a 50-mile radius. They checked reports of suspicious vehicles. They followed every tip, no matter how remote. But Angela Salmons had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The trail held no answers. The woods kept their secrets. And a family, a community, was left with nothing but questions and the unbearable weight of not knowing. As July became August, as the humid summer slowly, inexorably moved toward fall, one terrible truth became clear. Angela wasn't coming home. At least, not the way everyone hoped. And somewhere, someone knew what happened. Someone had answers. Someone was living with the knowledge of what they'd done, walking those same streets, perhaps even joining the searches, offering sympathy to the grieving family. someone new. And for the next 38 years, they kept quiet. The search. Years of silence. The investigation into Angela Salmon's disappearance consumed the Harlan County Sheriff's Department through the fall of 1987. Sheriff Tom Grayson worked 16-hour days, skipped meals, aged visibly. His wife told friends he woke in the night, thinking he'd heard Angela's name called. Deputy Marshal Crawford stopped attending church, couldn't bear sitting in pews surrounded by people asking questions he couldn't answer. By September, when school started and Angela's junior year began without her, her empty desk in Mrs. Palmer's English class became a memorial. Students left notes there, small gifts, flowers. The yearbook staff reserved a full page for her, though they didn't know whether to write "in memory of" or "missing." The distinction mattered. Missing meant hope. Memorial meant acceptance. Patricia Salmons returned to work at the Piggly Wiggly in October. She needed the money. The searches had cost the family everything they'd saved. But more than that, she needed the routine, the distraction. Customers didn't know what to say to her. Some avoided her register entirely. Others gripped her hand while she scanned their groceries, murmuring inadequate condolences. Patricia endured it all with a kind of numb grace, functioning on autopilot, her real self suspended in that Saturday morning when her daughter had walked out the door. Robert Salmons went back to the mines. Third shift, descending into darkness, which felt appropriate somehow. Underground in the close black earth, he could pretend the world didn't exist. Michael, now 14, became quiet and withdrawn. He stopped playing baseball. His grades dropped. The guidance counselor called Patricia several times, concerned about trauma, about grief in adolescence, about the need for therapy. But Patricia was barely keeping her own head above water. How could she save her son when she couldn't save herself? The house on Maple Street became a shrine. Angela's room remained exactly as she'd left it. Her bed made, her clothes in the closet, the herbs in her garden plot untended grew wild and then withered with the first frost. Patricia couldn't bring herself to clean it up. It was still Angela's garden. She might come home and want to see it. Families of missing persons live in a particular kind of purgatory, unable to grieve properly because there's no body, no confirmation, no closure, but unable to hope properly either because with each passing day, the likelihood of a miracle diminishes. They exist in limbo, suspended between the life before and the life after, unable to fully enter either. The first anniversary of Angela's disappearance came and went. A memorial service at the Methodist Church. More candles, more prayers, more tears. The news crews returned briefly, doing follow-up stories. 1 year later, a Harlan County family still seeks answers. But public attention fades. New tragedies emerge. The news cycle moves on. The investigation technically remained open, but active leads had dried up by mid-1988. Sheriff Grayson kept the file on his desk, literally, physically on his desk, refusing to put it away as if proximity might somehow generate new evidence. He'd reviewed it hundreds of times, the timeline, the witness statements, the physical evidence which amounted to so little. One backpack, some disturbed ground, unidentifiable footprints. The theory that held the most weight was that Angela had encountered someone on or near the trail, either someone she knew or a stranger, who had taken her by force or deception. The backpack being hidden suggested the perpetrator had time and presence of mind to conceal evidence. The lack of screams or commotion heard by anyone suggested either a quick attack or someone Angela trusted. The dog losing her scent suggested she'd been taken away in a vehicle, though no one had reported seeing any cars near the trail that morning. But who? That was the question that haunted everyone. The detectives had looked at everyone, men with records, men with no records but suspicious behavior. Ex-boyfriends, though Angela hadn't been seriously dating anyone. friends of the family, strangers passing through. They'd looked and found nothing concrete enough to build a case on. Some suspicion fell on Dale Hutchins, a 43-year-old man who lived alone in a trailer at the edge of town, who'd been seen near the high school that weekend. Hutchins had a record, a minor assault charge from years prior, some drunk and disorderly conduct. He was interviewed repeatedly, his trailer searched, with consent, his vehicle examined. Nothing connected him to Angela. He'd been at work at the auto parts store from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. that Saturday, verified by multiple witnesses and time cards. But rumors persisted because people needed someone to blame, someone to point to, even without evidence. Other suspicion, whispered rather than stated, touched a different figure entirely. Someone more prominent, more protected. But without evidence, such whispers remained just that, whispers. Years accumulated. 1988 became 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. The world moved forward as the world does, indifferent to individual grief. Patricia aged 20 years and 5. Robert's hair went completely gray. Michael left for college, University of Kentucky, as far from Harlan County as he could manage while staying in state, and rarely came home. The house on Maple Street felt emptier and emptier. In 1995, 8 years after Angela vanished, the case was officially designated cold. The active investigation ceased. The file went into archives. Sheriff Grayson, by then retired, kept a copy of everything in his garage. He couldn't let it go. On his deathbed in 2003, he told his wife, "I failed that girl. I failed that family." Those were among his last words. But even as official channels went quiet, Patricia Salmons never stopped. She joined organizations for families of missing persons. She attended conferences. She learned about advocacy, about cold case review, about new forensic technologies. She kept Angela's case alive through sheer force of will. Writing to state legislators, contacting new sheriffs when elections brought fresh faces, submitting Angela's information to every database and missing persons registry that emerged as the internet age dawned. In 1998, Patricia created a website, one of the first of its kind for a cold case. Help Find Angela Salmons featured her photo, the details of her disappearance, contact information for tips. Patricia taught herself basic HTML coding, updating the site regularly with her own memories, appeals, poems she'd written. The site received thousands of hits but generated no useful leads. The community, meanwhile, had tried to move forward. The trail behind the high school, unofficially renamed Angela's Trail by locals, became less traveled. Parents kept their children away from it. It gained a reputation for being haunted, though really it was just haunted by memory. Someone placed a cross at the spot where the backpack had been found. Over the years, people left flowers there, stuffed animals, notes to a girl who'd become a symbol of every parent's worst fear. Harlan County itself struggled through those decades. The coal industry's decline accelerated, mines closed, people moved away seeking work, the population dwindled. The town that had come together in 1987 slowly came apart, not from Angela's case specifically, but from the broader economic and social forces reshaping Appalachia. Yet those who remained never quite forgot. The case was part of the town's identity, a scar that never quite healed. In the early 2000s, new sheriffs and new investigators occasionally reviewed the cold case. Advances in forensic technology meant old evidence could be re-examined. The backpack, stored in the evidence room for years, was sent to a state lab for new testing in 2007. DNA technology had advanced significantly. Perhaps something could be found that 1987 technology had missed, but the results were disappointing. The backpack yielded Angela's DNA as expected, and several other profiles, partial, degraded, impossible to match to anyone in the databases. Thousands of people had touched that backpack over the years, the person who found it, the officers who processed it, investigators who'd examined it. Without a suspect to compare the DNA to, it was meaningless. By 2010, Patricia Salmons was in her 60s, her health failing. Years of stress and grief had taken their toll. High blood pressure, 2 minor heart attacks, chronic anxiety. Robert had passed away in 2006, his body worn out from decades in the mines and decades of carrying sorrow. Michael, now married with children of his own, lived in Lexington and visited only on holidays, the memories of Harlan too painful. The case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. One of those tragic mysteries that plague every region, the girl who vanished, the family that never got answers, the killer who got away with it. Patricia, aging and ill, made peace with the likelihood that she'd die without knowing what happened to her daughter. She just prayed someone someday would figure it out, for Angela's sake. So her daughter's life and death wouldn't be meaningless. But then in 2024, something shifted. Not dramatically at first, just a small thing. A new detective assigned to review cold cases as part of a state initiative. A young woman named Detective Sarah Chen, 32 years old, who'd grown up in California and moved to Kentucky for her husband's job. Chen had no connection to Harlan County, no preconceptions about the case, no sacred cows she wouldn't examine. She'd been reviewing cold cases for several months when she came across Angela Salmon's file. Something about it caught her attention. Not the lack of evidence, but the type of evidence that existed. The backpack hidden, the scent trail ending. The lack of any confirmed sighting after 10:47 a.m. Chen, trained in modern profiling techniques, saw a pattern. This wasn't a random attack. This was someone who knew the area, knew the routine, had planned, or at least had time to think through covering their tracks. Chen began re-interviewing people, starting with those still alive who'd been interviewed in 1987. Most were elderly now, if they were alive at all. But cold case investigations often benefit from distance. People who'd been scared to talk decades ago, who'd been protecting someone or themselves, who'd been worried about reputations or consequences, sometimes after enough years pass, they're willing to tell the truth. And in the fall of 2024, 37 years after Angela disappeared, someone finally did. The turning point. A whisper becomes a voice. Detective Sarah Chen had learned early in her career that cold cases crack not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through patience and the slow accumulation of details. She'd been assigned to the Kentucky State Police Cold Case Unit in early 2023, and by the time she opened the Salmons file in April 2024, she'd already worked through 17 unsolved cases, bringing closure to 4 families. She knew the particular rhythm of cold case work, the long, tedious days of reviewing old reports, the interviews with elderly witnesses whose memories had faded, the dead ends that vastly outnumbered the breakthroughs. The Salmons case had landed on her desk marked Priority Review because Patricia Salmons, now 73 and in declining health, had written yet another letter to the governor's office. Patricia had been writing such letters for 37 years, but this one apparently hit the right desk at the right time. Someone with authority had written back, promising a fresh review. That promise had filtered down through bureaucracy until it reached Detective Chen's desk. Chen spent the first week simply reading everything. The initial investigation reports, witness statements, search logs, evidence inventories, lab reports from 1987 and the re-examination in 2007, news articles, even the posts from Patricia's website. She made timelines, drew maps, created a profile of Angela Salmons, studious, responsible, animal-loving, well-liked, no enemies, no reason to run away, no signs of depression or suicidal ideation. Then she profiled the perpetrator based on the crime scene. Someone who knew the area well enough to hide evidence quickly. Someone comfortable in those woods. Someone who'd either planned the attack or who'd had enough presence of mind during a crime of opportunity to conceal the backpack. Someone strong enough to subdue or carry a teenage girl, or persuasive enough to get her to go willingly. Someone who'd been interviewed in 1987, most likely, because the investigators had been thorough. Someone who'd successfully passed scrutiny then but might crack now under fresh questioning with 3 decades of guilt weighing on them. Chen created a list of people to re-interview. Some were dead. Sheriff Grayson, deceased. Dale Hutchins, the early suspect, deceased. Mr. Henderson, the last confirmed person to see Angela, deceased. But others remained. Casey Mitchell, Angela's best friend, now 54 and living in Virginia. Several of Angela's other friends scattered across the country but traceable. Teachers who'd been at the high school. Volunteers who'd been active in the search. And then there was a name that kept appearing in the margins of the old reports, not as a suspect, never formally questioned, but present. Present at the searches, present in the community. Someone who'd known the family, known Angela, known the area. Richard Sloan. In 1987, Sloan had been 34 years old, a deputy with the Harlan County Sheriff's Department. He'd worked the case, participated in searches, interviewed witnesses. He'd been present in the Salmons' home that first terrible night, helping coordinate efforts. He'd been considered beyond suspicion because he was one of them. Law enforcement, a trusted member of the community. A man who'd seemed genuinely distraught about Angela's disappearance. By 2024, Richard Sloan was 71 years old, long retired from law enforcement, living alone on a property about 12 miles outside Harlan. He'd been married twice, divorced twice. No children. He'd left the sheriff's department in 1994, officially citing stress and health issues, though some who remembered said there'd been questions about his conduct. Nothing formal but whispers about his interactions with young female arrestees. Complaints that had never quite turned into formal investigations. Chen pulled Sloan's personnel file. There it was. Vague notation from 1992 about counseling required after a female suspect claimed Sloan had been inappropriately familiar during a traffic stop. The complaint had been investigated internally and deemed unsubstantiated. Sloan had received counseling and continued working until his resignation 2 years later. It wasn't much. It might be nothing. But Chen had learned to trust her instincts, and something about Richard Sloan's name appearing repeatedly in the 1987 reports made her pause. He'd been there, in the middle of everything, with access to information, with knowledge of search patterns, with the trust of the family. If someone wanted to hide in plain sight, being part of the investigation was a pretty good way to do it. Chen decided to interview him, not as a suspect. She didn't have grounds for that, but as a witness who might remember details. She contacted Sloan in June 2024, introducing herself, explaining she was reviewing the Salmons case, requesting a conversation. Sloan agreed immediately, seemingly eager to help. They scheduled a meeting at his home for June 18th. Chen drove out to Sloan's property on a humid Tuesday afternoon. The house was a small ranch-style building on 10 acres, isolated, surrounded by woods. Sloan met her at the door, a tall man, still broad-shouldered despite his age, with thinning gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years outdoors. He was friendly, invited her in, offered coffee. They sat in his living room and Chen asked him to walk through his memories of July 1987. Sloan talked easily, his recall seemingly sharp. He described the initial call, arriving at the Salmons' house, coordinating search efforts. He spoke about how dedicated everyone had been, how hard they'd worked to find Angela. He expressed continued regret that the case had never been solved. "That one haunted Tom Grayson until he died," Sloan said, referring to the late sheriff. "Haunted all of us, really. Sweet girl like that just vanishing. We tried everything. I must have walked that trail 100 times. Chen asked about specific details. Had Sloan been on the trail that Saturday morning before Angela disappeared? No. He'd been off duty at home working on his truck. Had he seen anything unusual in the days before? No. Nothing. Had he had any personal interaction with Angela? Only in passing. She'd been a friend of his niece's, though they weren't close. This last detail was new to Chen. Your niece knew Angela? Yeah, they were in some classes together at the high school. Sarah, my niece, she was real torn up about it. Still is, I think, though we don't talk much anymore. Chen made note of this. After an hour, she thanked Sloan for his time and left. But as she drove back to her office, something nagged at her. Sloan's demeanor had been perfect. Helpful, regretful, appropriately emotional, almost too perfect. And that mention of his niece felt calculated, like he was establishing a personal but not too personal connection to Angela. Chen had interviewed enough people to recognize when someone was managing their presentation carefully. She decided to dig deeper into Richard Sloan's background. What she found was interesting. After leaving the sheriff's department, Sloan had worked security for a few years, then had cobbled together a living doing odd jobs, construction, handyman work. His financial records, which Chen obtained through the legal process of cold case investigation, showed periods of instability. He'd filed for bankruptcy once. Both ex-wives had filed restraining orders during their divorces, though both had been dismissed. Most interesting was something Chen found in old records from 1988. A woman named Teresa Pruitt had filed a report claiming Sloan had followed her home from a bar one night, had sat in his car outside her apartment for hours. Pruitt had been 21 at the time, around Angela's age. The report had been filed with the state police, not the local sheriff's department. It had been investigated briefly, but Sloan had claimed it was a misunderstanding, that he'd been in the area coincidentally. Pruitt had moved away shortly after, and the matter was dropped. Chen tracked down Teresa Pruitt, now 58 and living in Ohio. When Chen called and identified herself, Pruitt was silent for a long moment. Then, "Is this about Richard Sloan?" Chen's pulse quickened. "Why would you think that?" "Because I've been waiting 37 years for someone to call about Richard Sloan." What Pruitt told Chen over the next hour changed everything. Back in 1988, Pruitt had been a bartender at a place called Riley's, a honky-tonk on the outskirts of Harlan. Sloan had been a regular customer. He'd always been friendly to her, tipped well, but there was something about the way he watched her that made her uncomfortable. After the Angela Salmons case, Pruitt had noticed Sloan talking about it obsessively, bringing it up in conversation, speculating about what had happened, seeming almost excited by it. Then came the night he'd followed her home. Pruitt had noticed his truck behind her on the rural road to her apartment. He'd parked across the street and sat there for what she estimated was 3 hours. She'd called the police, but by the time they arrived, Sloan was gone. When she'd filed the report, she'd specifically said she thought Sloan might have been involved in Angela's disappearance. That detail wasn't in the brief incident report Chen had found. It had been omitted or lost. "Nobody took me seriously," Pruitt said. "He was a cop. I was a bartender, and I had no proof of anything except that he creeped me out and followed me that one time. I moved away because I was scared. I've thought about Angela Salmons probably once a week for the rest of my life, wondering if I should have done more." Chen thanked Pruitt and immediately began pulling every piece of documentation related to Sloan she could find. Property records, employment records, DMV records, and she began reaching out to his ex-wives. The first ex-wife, Margaret Sloan, remarried and living in Tennessee, refused to talk initially. But when Chen pressed, explaining this was related to a murder investigation, Margaret's resolve cracked. "What do you want to know?" she asked quietly. "I want to know what Richard Sloan is capable of," Chen said. There was a long pause. Then, I was married to him for 6 years. They were the worst years of my life. Richard was controlling doesn't even cover it. He tracked everywhere I went. He questioned every conversation I had. He accused me of things I didn't do. And he was fascinated by violence. True crime shows, serial killer books, news stories about abductions. He watched them constantly, talked about them. He'd say things like, "Those idiots always make mistakes. If it were me, I'd do it differently." I thought he was just, I don't know, working through his job stress. But after we separated, I wondered, especially about that girl who went missing when we were first married. The one from Harlan. Angela Salmons? Yeah. Richard was obsessed with that case. He had files on it at home, notes, maps. He said it was because he'd worked it, but it seemed like more than that. He talked about her like he knew her personally, though he said he didn't. After I left him, I thought about calling someone, telling them to look at Richard. But what was I going to say? My ex-husband is weird and watched too much true crime TV. I didn't think anyone would listen. Chen's investigation accelerated. She obtained a warrant to access Sloan's cell phone records, his internet history, his financial transactions. Modern surveillance technology meant she could track patterns, and a pattern emerged. Multiple times over the years, Sloan had driven past the Salmons' house. He'd visited Angela's trail. He'd attended memorials. This wasn't unusual for someone who'd worked the case, except that he continued doing it decades after retiring, long after any professional reason to maintain interest. In August 2024, Chen interviewed Sloan's second ex-wife, Linda Caldwell, who'd kept her maiden name after the divorce. Caldwell was more forthcoming than Margaret had been. "Richard has a temper," she said, "and he has a thing about control, about being smarter than everyone else." One time we were watching a show about cold cases, and there was one about a missing girl. Richard said, "That detective is an idiot. The answer is obvious. The person who found the body probably put it there. Law enforcement always overlooks their own." I asked him what he meant, and he got angry, said I wouldn't understand. It was chilling. By September 2024, Detective Chen had enough to seek a search warrant for Sloan's property. The warrant was issued on September 23rd, based on the combination of witness statements, behavioral evidence, and his presence in the original investigation creating opportunity. Early morning on September 25th, state police descended on Richard Sloan's home. What they found would break the case wide open, but not in the way anyone expected. The search would take days and would unearth secrets buried for nearly 4 decades. And it would finally give Patricia Salmons, dying in a nursing home in Lexington, the answers she'd waited a lifetime to receive. The discovery. What the earth finally released. The search of Richard Sloan's property began at 6:47 a.m. on September 25, 2024. 23 investigators descended on the isolated 10-acre lot. Forensic specialists, cadaver dog handlers, crime scene techs, and Detective Sarah Chen, who'd spent 3 months building the case that made this moment possible. The morning was cool and misty, the kind of Appalachian autumn dawn that burns off into warm afternoons, and as the investigators pulled up the long gravel drive, Richard Sloan was standing on his porch, coffee cup in hand, watching them come. He didn't look surprised. If anything, Chen would later recall, he looked almost relieved. The search began with the house itself, a methodical room-by-room examination. What they found in the first 2 hours was disturbing but not conclusive. In a locked filing cabinet in Sloan's bedroom, investigators discovered a folder labeled simply A.S., Angela Salmons' initials. Inside were newspaper clippings about her disappearance, printed pages from Patricia's website, photocopied pages from the original investigation file, materials Sloan shouldn't have had access to after leaving the department, materials that suggested an ongoing obsession. More chilling was a small box found in the back of his bedroom closet. Inside were items that appeared to be trophies or keepsakes. A hair ribbon that might have been from the 1980s, a school ID badge from Harlan County High School dated 1986, not Angela's, someone else's. Photographs of young women torn from yearbooks, a small silver earring. Each item suggested victims, though without context, it was impossible to know if these were connected to crimes or simply the disturbing collection of someone with an unhealthy fixation. Richard Sloan, handcuffed and sitting in the back of a police vehicle while the search continued, watched impassively as investigators carried boxes from his home. He'd invoked his right to an attorney immediately and said nothing beyond that. His face remained neutral, unreadable, giving nothing away. But it was outside, on the property itself, where the real breakthrough came. Among the search team were two cadaver dogs, highly trained German shepherds named Scout and Bella, who'd successfully located remains in dozens of investigations. The handlers began working them through the wooded areas of Sloan's property around 9 a.m. The land was typical of eastern Kentucky, hilly, densely forested with rocky outcroppings and thick underbrush that hadn't been cleared in years. It would take hours to search thoroughly. At 11:34 a.m., Scout began exhibiting alert behavior near an area approximately 200 yards behind Sloan's house, in a section of woods that backed up to state forest land. The dog circled, whined, pawed at the ground, then sat, the trained signal for human remains detection. The forensic team moved in. The area Scout had indicated appeared unremarkable. Just forest floor covered in decades of leaf litter, some larger rocks, a few fallen logs. But cadaver dogs don't lie. If Scout said human remains were there, they were there. The excavation began slowly, carefully. Forensic archaeologists marked off a grid, removed leaf litter layer by layer, sifted soil, documented everything. 3 feet down, they encountered something that stopped everyone cold. Fabric. Blue fabric, degraded and earth-stained but unmistakably synthetic material from clothing. And near it a bone, small, identified by the forensic anthropologist on scene as a phalanx, a finger bone. The excavation expanded. By 4 p.m., they'd uncovered a complete skeleton in a shallow grave that had been covered carefully and left undisturbed for decades. The remains were small, clearly a young person, lying in what appeared to be a fetal position. Scraps of clothing remained, denim consistent with shorts, fabric that might have once been yellow, fragments of rubber from shoes. Detective Chen stood at the edge of the excavation site, her heart pounding, thinking about Patricia Salmon's dying in a nursing home, thinking about the hundreds of people who'd searched these woods in vain 37 years ago, thinking about Angela Salmon's, 16 years old, with her whole life ahead of her, reduced to bones in a shallow grave behind the house of a man who'd pretended to help find her. The remains were carefully extricated, photographed, documented, and transported to the state medical examiner's office in Frankfort. The process would take weeks: dental record comparison, DNA extraction and matching, forensic anthropology analysis to determine cause of death, age at death, and time since death. But everyone already knew. This was Angela Salmon's. They'd finally found her. The arrest of Richard Sloan on suspicion of murder was executed at 6:15 p.m. that evening. He was transported to the Kentucky State Police Post in Harlan and booked. He remained silent, speaking only to confirm his identity and request his attorney. His face, captured by news crews who'd gotten wind of the search, showed nothing. No remorse, no fear, just a kind of blank acceptance. News of the discovery spread through Harlan County like wildfire. Within hours, everyone knew. Angela Salmon's had been found. The nightmare that had lasted 37 years was finally, horribly over. Patricia Salmons received the news in her nursing home room. Michael, her son, had driven from Lexington when he'd heard about the search of Sloane's property. He was there when Detective Chen called. He held his mother's hand while Chen gently explained that they'd found remains, that they believed they were Angela's, that there would be confirmation, but that Patricia should know her daughter was coming home. Patricia, 73 years old, ravaged by decades of grief and illness, closed her eyes and wept. Not from sadness. She'd been sad for 37 years. These were tears of relief. "She's not in the woods alone anymore," Patricia whispered. "She can come home." The forensic analysis took 3 weeks. Dental records confirmed the identity. Angela Marie Salmons, born February 3, 1971, missing since July 18, 1987, found September 25, 2024. The skeletal analysis revealed she'd suffered blunt force trauma to the skull, at least 2 impacts, enough to cause death or unconsciousness. There was evidence of strangulation as well, though the hyoid bone damage was subtle, indicating either manual strangulation or ligature strangulation with a soft material. She died between late morning and early afternoon on July 18, 1987, within hours of disappearing. The forensic pathologist's report painted a grim picture. Angela had likely been attacked on or near the trail, struck in the head, then strangled. She'd been dead or dying when she was transported to Sloane's property, which he'd owned since 1985, 2 years before Angela's murder, and buried in a grave that had been prepared or quickly dug. The location was hidden enough that searchers in 1987 wouldn't have found it, especially since no one had reason to search a deputy sheriff's property. Further analysis of the evidence from Sloane's house revealed more secrets. That box of keepsakes was processed for DNA. The hair ribbon yielded a profile that matched a cold case from 1992. A 17-year-old girl named Jennifer Marks who disappeared from a neighboring county and was never found. The school ID belonged to another missing girl, Tracy Simmons, who'd vanished in 1995. The photographs came from various high school yearbooks spanning the 1980s and early 1990s. Investigators began the horrific process of determining whether Richard Sloane was not just Angela's killer but a serial offender who'd preyed on young women for years. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to search the rest of his property. They found 3 more areas with suspicious readings. Additional excavations uncovered the remains of 2 more individuals, later identified through DNA as Jennifer Marks and Tracy Simmons. 3 families, 3 unsolved disappearances across multiple counties, all connected to one man, Richard Sloane, a former law enforcement officer who'd used his position, his knowledge, and his trust to hunt, kill, and hide his victims. The investigation into Sloane's complete history would take months and is still ongoing. But the focus here, the heart of this story, remains Angela Salmons, the 16-year-old girl who walked into the woods on a July morning and never walked out, whose family waited 37 years for answers, whose community never forgot her. On October 15, 2024, Richard Sloane was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Angela Salmons, Jennifer Marks, and Tracy Simmons. Additional charges were filed for abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence, and a litany of other crimes. He pleaded not guilty. His attorney claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that the remains found on his property could have been placed there by someone else, that being a former law enforcement officer made him an easy target for an overzealous cold case detective. But the evidence was overwhelming. DNA from Angela's remains matched DNA found in Sloane's house, trace evidence showing he'd been in contact with her after her death. Soil samples from his property matched soil embedded in her clothing. Forensic analysis of his property showed he'd made improvements to the area where the graves were located shortly after each disappearance, landscaping that effectively concealed the burial sites. Most damning were the digital records. In 2007, when he'd first gotten a home computer, Sloan had searched online for decomposition rates Kentucky, statute of limitations murder, and cold case solved evidence. He'd visited websites about the Angela Salmons case repeatedly. He'd kept digital files, organized, detailed notes about each of his victims, hidden in encrypted folders that forensic tech specialists cracked open. Richard Sloan had not only murdered these young women, he'd documented it. He'd kept records like trophies, and he'd lived his life in plain sight, attending memorials, expressing sympathy, even helping with searches, knowing all along where the answers lay. How do you process something like that? How does a community reconcile the monster who lived among them, who wore a badge, who they'd trusted? Harlan County, already struggling with decades of economic decline and social fragmentation, now had to confront a horror from within its own institutions. But amid the horror, there was also something else. Closure. Painful, terrible closure, but closure nonetheless. 3 families could finally lay their daughters to rest. 3 cold cases were solved, and Angela Salmons could finally go home. Aftermath. When the woods let go. The funeral for Angela Marie Salmons was held on November 2, 2024. 37 years, 3 months, and 15 days after she disappeared. It was a cool autumn Saturday, the kind of day where the Kentucky hills blaze with color, oranges and reds and golds against a crystalline blue sky. The Methodist Church on Main Street, the same church that had held vigils and memorial services and so many prayers, was filled beyond capacity. Over 600 people attended. Patricia Salmons was there, wheeled in from the nursing home, frail and oxygen-dependent but determined. She'd waited nearly 4 decades for this moment, the moment when she could finally say goodbye to her daughter properly, when Angela would be laid to rest with dignity and love. Michael stood beside his mother's wheelchair. His own children, Angela's nieces and nephews who'd never known her, clustered around. The casket was white, covered in yellow roses, Angela's favorite color. Inside were the remains that had finally been released by the medical examiner, along with some of Angela's belongings that Patricia had preserved all these years. Her stuffed rabbit from childhood, a photo of the family taken on Angela's 16th birthday just weeks before she vanished, a letter Patricia had written to her daughter years ago but never sent because there was no address to send it to. The service was beautiful and heartbreaking. The pastor spoke of loss and faith, of the long wait for justice, of Angela's bright spirit that had touched so many lives in her brief time. Casey Mitchell, now 54, Angela's best friend from that long-ago summer, stood and spoke through tears about the girl she'd been waiting for at the pool on July 18, 1987. She was supposed to be there at noon, Casey said, echoing the words she'd spoken 37 years ago. And I waited. We all waited. But now, finally, she's where she's supposed to be, at peace. The burial was at the Harlan County Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the town. Angela's plot was next to her father's. Robert had been buried there in 2006, and Patricia had purchased 3 plots then, hoping against hope that someday Angela would come home and they'd all be together again. Now that terrible wish had come true. As the casket was lowered into the earth, Patricia Salmons placed her hand on the smooth white surface one last time. "Sleep now, baby," she whispered. "You're safe now. Mama's here. We're all here. You're not alone anymore." The community that turned out for Angela's funeral was not the same community that had searched for her in 1987. Harlan had changed, smaller, older, marked by economic decline and social change. But the memory of Angela Salmons had remained constant, a thread connecting past to present. For those who'd been there in 1987, the funeral brought a kind of release. They'd searched and prayed and hoped and grieved, and now they could finally let go. A permanent memorial was erected at the high school, a bronze plaque with Angela's photo and a brief inscription. Angela Marie Salmons, 1971-1987, forever 16, forever remembered, forever loved. The trail behind the school, Angela's Trail, was officially renamed and marked with signs. A bench was placed at the clearing where Angela used to release injured birds with an inscription, "Rest here and remember kindness." Patricia Salmons passed away on December 8, 2024, just over a month after Angela's funeral. Her health, already failing, seemed to have been sustained purely by willpower, the need to see her daughter laid to rest. Once that was accomplished, Patricia let go. She died peacefully in her sleep, Michael at her side. Her last words, spoken the evening before, were, "Tell Angela I'll see her soon." Patricia was buried next to Angela and Robert. 3 plots, 3 graves, a family reunited after decades of separation. At Patricia's funeral, Detective Sarah Chen attended and stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the people of Harlan County say goodbye to a woman who'd become a symbol of maternal devotion and persistence. Chen thought about the letter Patricia had written to the governor that had landed on her desk, about the chain of events that had led to Angela's discovery. If Patricia hadn't kept fighting, hadn't kept Angela's case alive through decades of official indifference, the case might never have been solved. Patricia Salmons had found her daughter through sheer force of will and love. The trial of Richard Sloan began in March 2025. It would last 6 weeks and would be one of the most significant criminal cases in Kentucky history. Not just for the murders themselves, but for what they revealed about institutional failures. How had a deputy sheriff been able to kill multiple young women without detection? Why had complaints about his behavior been dismissed or inadequately investigated? What systemic changes needed to happen to prevent similar tragedies? The trial brought all of it into public view. Witnesses testified to Sloan's obsessive behavior, his access to information about the searches and investigations, his ability to deflect suspicion. Forensic experts explained the evidence in painstaking detail. Families of the victims, Michael Salmons for Angela, parents and siblings for Jennifer Marks and Tracy Simmons, gave victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. Richard Sloan, now 72 years old, sat impassively through most of it. His defense was weak, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, that he'd been framed, that there was reasonable doubt. But the evidence was overwhelming. DNA, physical evidence, his own digital records, witness testimony. It all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. On April 18, 2025, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all counts. 3 counts of first-degree murder. Richard Sloan showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 1 life sentence for each victim. As he was led out of the courtroom, Sloan paused and looked directly at Michael Salmons, who sat in the front row. For just a moment, something flickered across Sloan's face. Not remorse, but acknowledgement. A recognition that his secret was finally out, that the game was over, that he'd lost. Then he turned and was escorted away, disappearing into the prison system where he'll spend his remaining years. The conviction brought a measure of justice, though justice can never truly balance the scales when young lives are stolen. Angela Salmons should have graduated high school, should have gone to college, should have become a veterinarian, should have married and had children and grown old. Jennifer Marks should have had those opportunities. Tracy Simmons should have had them. Instead, their lives were cut short by a predator who used his position of trust to hunt them. But their deaths were not meaningless. The investigation into Sloan's crimes led to significant reforms in law enforcement oversight in Kentucky. Background checks for police officers were strengthened. Complaints against officers are now tracked more systematically. Cold case units received additional funding, and families of other missing persons across the state found renewed hope that their cases might be solved too. Harlan County, meanwhile, began a process of collective healing. The town organized a memorial walk in May 2025, following Angela's trail, which had been cleaned up and maintained properly for the first time in years. Hundreds participated, walking the path Angela had taken that July morning, reflecting on loss and memory and the importance of community. At the clearing where Angela used to release birds, people left flowers and notes and small mementos. The case captured national attention. Documentaries were filmed, books were written. Angela's story became known far beyond Kentucky, a cautionary tale about predators in positions of trust, about the importance of listening to victims, about the power of persistence in seeking justice. But for those who'd known her, who'd loved her, who'd searched for her, Angela was never just a story. She was a real girl with real dreams, whose life mattered, whose loss left a permanent void. Michael Sammons, now in his 50s, became an advocate for victims' families. He speaks at conferences, works with cold case organizations, helps other families navigate the terrible limbo of having a missing loved one. He talks about his mother's tireless advocacy, about his sister's kindness, about the importance of never giving up. Angela never got to live the life she deserved, Michael says, but her story can help others. That's her legacy. The woods behind Harlan County High School, those dense Kentucky hills that kept secrets for nearly 4 decades, are different now. They're still beautiful, still marked by seasonal change, still home to wildlife, still the same physical space. But they feel lighter somehow, as if a burden has been lifted. The trees that witnessed whatever happened to Angela on July 18, 1987, no longer hold that weight alone. The truth is out. The guilty have been caught. The dead have been laid to rest. On quiet days, when the wind moves through those trees, locals say you can almost feel peace there. Not the absence of tragedy, that can never be erased, but something like resolution. A sense that the woods finally let go of what they'd held for so long, that they gave up their secrets, that justice, delayed but not denied, finally came. Angela's grave at Harlan County Cemetery is visited regularly. People leave flowers, stuffed animals, notes. Her headstone reads simply, Angela Marie Sammons, beloved daughter and sister, forever young, forever remembered, forever free. Next to it, Patricia's grave bears an inscription chosen by Michael. Devoted mother who never stopped searching, together again. The animal shelter where Angela volunteered has a plaque in her honor in the cat room, where she spent so many Saturday mornings caring for strays. The Angela Sammons Memorial Cattery, it reads, in memory of a young woman who showed kindness to the smallest and most vulnerable. The shelter continues her work, and staff members tell new volunteers about the 16-year-old girl who dreamed of being a veterinarian and who treated every injured animal with gentleness and hope. The house on Maple Street where Angela grew up has changed hands several times over the years. The current owners, who moved in after Patricia's death, maintain the flower garden. Those blue hydrangeas still bloom every summer, as impossible and beautiful as they were in 1987. The new owners know the history. They're respectful of it. Sometimes they see people pause in front of the house, looking at it, remembering. The owners understand. This is a place where love lived, where tragedy struck, where a family endured the unendurable. What do we take from stories like Angela's? What lessons, what meaning, what purpose can we extract from senseless tragedy? Perhaps this, that love endures even when life doesn't, that communities matter, that connections matter, that remembering matters, that the people we lose are never truly gone as long as we keep their memory alive, that justice, even delayed by decades, is still worth pursuing, that one person, One detective, one mother, one friend who refuses to forget can make a difference. Angela Salmons lived for 16 years. She loved animals and her family and summer days and dreams of the future. She was kind and responsible and bright, a good kid, as everyone who knew her said. She deserved to live a long, full life. She deserved to see her dreams come true. She deserved so much more than she got. But her story didn't end on July 18, 1987, in those woods. It continued through her mother's tireless advocacy, through a community that never forgot, through a detective who refused to accept defeat, through all the people who kept her memory alive. Angela's life had meaning. Her death had impact. And her legacy, the reforms made, the other cases solved, the hope given to other families, continues. The woods of eastern Kentucky are ancient and patient. They've seen generations come and go, have witnessed countless human dramas, have held countless secrets. Most of those secrets stay hidden forever, lost to time and decay and the indifference of nature. But occasionally, rarely, the woods decide to speak. They give up what they've held. They let the truth emerge. In the fall of 2024, after 37 years of silence, the woods spoke. They released Angela Salmons. They exposed Richard Sloan. They allowed justice to finally be served. And in doing so, they reminded us that truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried deep, even after decades, even when everyone has given up hope. Angela Salmons walked into the woods on a summer morning in 1987. 37 years later, she finally walked out, not in life, but in memory and truth and the justice that came at last. Her family found peace. Her community found closure. And the woods, those patient witnesses, finally let go of their terrible secret. Rest in peace, Angela Marie Salmons. You are remembered, you are honored, you are home. If this case touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every case we cover takes weeks of research and is told with the deepest respect for the victims and their families. Let us know in the comments what aspect of Angela's story affected you most. For more true crime investigations and cold cases solved, check out the cases linked in the description below. Thank you for watching, for remembering, and for caring about these stories that matter.